You are listening to All In, a podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jroper. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of All In. This is a special episode because this is episode number 100. Woohoo! Can you imagine that? 100 episodes. Well, may not be a big deal to you, but did you know that the average podcast only lasts 7 episodes? So here we are, episode 100. I wasn't even thinking about it, honestly, until last week. My daughter and show producer, Elizabeth Horn, told me, "Hey, Dad, we've got episode 100 coming up. You should do something special for that." And then I received a comment on one of my postings on a recent episode, and the guy commented, said, "Hey, we are about to have episode 100," which I loved it. You know, this person was putting themselves into the story about what we're doing here with the podcast. So with that, I thought, yeah, it'd be a great thing to do episode 100 celebration. Hey, before I get into some reflection on this 100th episode, just kind of let you know where things are at with me. Right now, I am quarantined in our apartment in Salo, Italy. We are located right in the middle between Milan and Venice, and we moved here on January 31st of this year of 2020. Well, we came to this region on the 31st. We ended up finding an apartment within about 2 weeks and moved into it just in time for the coronavirus to strike, and ended up the whole country is now in lockdown. Debbie was able to fly out. She's in the States right now. We have a daughter getting married, so she's in the States helping with that, and I am in the process of trying to change some flights, cancel some meetings, and try to get back into the U.S. But that's going to take a little bit of extra work, and so hopefully by the time this is released, that will have all been resolved. But, you know, it got me to thinking about some funny stuff that's happened as I've been in this ministry over the years. I got to thinking about my life sometimes feels like Forrest Gump. Like I'm remembering the Forrest Gump movie, how Forrest always ended up in these really strange moments in history. You know, ended up being at the door when the governor of Alabama stood in the doorway and tried to stop segregation, and he ended up in the White House, and all of these different things that Gump. Well, that's kind of the way I feel at times. I got to thinking about this, not only being at the epicenter of this coronavirus outbreak in Europe. It got me to thinking about the various things that I've seen over the years. Back when I first started working in Russia, being there in 1998, watching the economic collapse and the economic crisis of that country, the second one that it had experienced in recent years, and having friends, you know, lose everything, you know, what little savings they had accumulated in the bank, all being liquidated. And I remember one dear friend, he had built up, you know, just a $2,500 savings, which to them was quite a large amount of money, representing months and months of income, and all of it was liquidated. And the only way the bank could give him anything was he said, "Well, we had to foreclose on this upholstery company. Here, take $2,500 worth of upholstery." And that was that. And to watch that country go through that situation, or a year later, being there when Boris Yeltsin suddenly appointed this unknown character named Vladimir Putin to be his prime minister. And now here we are in 2020, some 20 years later, and Putin has ruled that nation. And being there and watching that all happen when it was taking place. And then back in 2006, my daughter and I were in Russia, flying back. She'd participated in doing some summer camps, and I didn't do the summer camps. I did other things besides camping with the Utes. But we flew to London, and as we were getting there, that whole terrorist plot was uncovered, that they had targeted the number of airlines that would be flying out of London, flying into the United States and into Canada. And they were going to put these explosives on the planes in the form of liquids, colas and sodas and different things. So since that time, you've not been able to go on an airplane with more than 3 ounces or 100 milliliters of liquid. Well, I was there when that happened, and let me tell you, if you've ever been to Heathrow, you know what a disaster and what a crazy chaotic airport that is. Well, you should see it when it's in a complete shutdown like that. And there were tens of thousands of us. It looked like a refugee camp, as it were, just tens of thousands of us stranded in Heathrow Airport. And the agent coming out, and just because you had to queue up in these lines and for hours trying to find out, hey, where are we going to stay? Everything is just in complete lockdown. And the agent just standing up on a table or a chair or something and just yelling out, "You're on your own, keep your receipts," and having to find our way through, and ended up spending several days stranded in London. We made the best out of it. And then there was another time, there was a big volcano in Iceland, but this was 2011, and it shut down all flights in Europe. And that caused me to get stranded in the city of Valencia, Spain, or as they would say it, Valencia, and ended up being stranded there for several days. And just thinking, how weird is this? And then being in Kyiv in 2014, watching the Maidan Revolution, and seeing this city that I love dearly and friends that I love dearly in such political turmoil, and watching what had happened on that main street there in Kyiv, and how they had turned it in, looked like a war zone. And then I got on a flight and I flew out, and just a matter of a day or two later is when the government started firing on its own citizens there in that square. Being there and seeing all of that was just amazing. And then, of course, the Russian invasion and occupation in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And then Debbie and I living in Greece for 5.5 years during its financial crisis, and watching catastrophic poverty and catastrophic unemployment just rattle this historic city and country, and watching these things happen. And then, of course, moving here to northern Italy just in time to watch this coronavirus pandemic gripping this country, and watching the situation as it's going on. So it's just really funny to feel like you've got a front seat at times in history and watching all of this happen. And so it's been a very interesting thing to see happen. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about this podcast and some reflections on episode number 100. First of all, I need to do a big shout out to my daughter and podcast producer, Elizabeth Horn, because I can tell you this, without her, this podcast would not exist. So big thank you to Elizabeth. She's talked me off the ledge multiple times. Even before I started this podcast, I had this idea, hey, I'm going to do a podcast. I was all pumped about it. I thought it'd be great. And then I recorded some preliminary stuff, and I listened to it, and I went into catatonic shock. I thought, nobody's going to want to hear my voice. It's terrible. Who would want to listen to that? I've always had this voice envy. You hear these guys have those amazing deep voices, and they just have the preacher's voice. And then when you hear your own and you realize that's not yours, it was terrible. And I just about pulled the plug on. I was trying to pull the plug on the podcast, and she just rolls her eyes and goes, "Dad, everybody hates the sound of their own voice." So thank you, Elizabeth, for not only talking me off the ledge that time, but multiple times, and always encouraging and putting this podcast together the way you do. And also another real big shout out to Jeffrey Forbes for his encouragement. And he also is the creator and the producer of the music that you hear on the intro and the outro. Kudos, Jeff. Thank you for making that for me and sending that my way. So people ask me, why do you do this podcast? What's your motive? What is it you want to do? Well, there's pretty much two reasons why I do it. The first one is to pay it forward. You see, when I was a young leader, I was I was desperate, man. I didn't know anything about what I was doing. I was in my 20s. I was pastoring a church. I I just didn't know anything about what I was doing. I thought I did when I first started, and then it took me about 3 months to realize I am way over my head. I need help. But I'd never been mentored. I'd never been discipled. I'd never had any of the things that so often we take for granted now. I mean, all I'd done was attend a church, and I'd heard my pastor preach, and I thought that's what God's called me to do. So I'm going to go do that. And so I just jumped in. It's kind of the way I was. I just jumped in, and I thought I'd figure this thing out later. Which, what's funny is that's actually how I learned how to swim. I didn't learn how to swim till I was probably close to 13 years old, 12, 13 years old. And my parents had bought us a membership to the local YMCA, and I got tired of looking at everybody else swimming in the swimming pool. And I said, today's the day I'm going to learn to swim. And I marched out there, climbed up onto the high dive and jumped. And I figured I'm either going to learn to swim or I'm going to die today, but I'm tired of being embarrassed. And thankfully, I managed to swim. I think it was the most god-awful dog paddle that has ever been done on the face of the planet, but I survived it. And that's been the way I've lived my life most of the time. And I don't recommend it. And please don't try this at home. But anyway, I'm paying it forward because when I was this young, desperate leader trying to find all of these resources and people who would mentor me, and I remember I would sit and beg pastors, please mentor me. And they just go, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do this. And so I just continued to search, and I would read everything I could read. I would listen to everything I could listen to. I would go to conferences, and eventually I ended up having two virtual mentors. John Maxwell is one of them. He had this tape club. Now this was back, young people, this was back in the dark ages. We actually had cassette tapes. And, I would use these cassette tapes, and I would get one every month. It was called the Enjoy Life Club. And every month he would record some kind of a lesson that he was doing either with his staff or out on the road. And it would be addressing some very practical issue about ministry, how to run a board meeting, how to do this, how to do that. It was just so rich and so practical. And every month that became my lifeline. So I would listen to these. I'd have to wait for them in the mail. Yes, they would actually have to cassettes coming to you in the mail. I know it's foreign to us nowadays, but back then there was, I look now and look at the podcasts that are available, iTunes University, where you can actually take university courses, all of the things that are available now. And I think, man, I would have died to have that kind of stuff back then. But all I could find was the Enjoy Life Club, and then I also found another mentor by the name of Ralph Moore. And Ralph produced some various little resources, a lot of stuff on house churches or what he called mini churches. And I just devoured everything I could from Ralph, and ended up, it was a great joy in my life years later that Ralph became a friend of mine, a personal friend. We ended up meeting at a series of meetings in Los Angeles that we had been both called to participate in, a small gathering of leaders. And we hit it off, and we started talking, and ended up, he started doing some traveling with me and doing some ministry here in Europe. And he's still involved here. And he was actually the very first guest on the podcast. We sat in a hotel room somewhere in Russia, and I just interviewed him, and it was like a dream come true. This man who had really had an impact on my life and my thinking about how to make disciples was now a friend. So I'm doing this to pay it forward to the young leaders out there who may be in the same situation I was in. You're looking for some help. You're looking for some people that you can say, hey, who can I learn from? Who are the people doing things now that maybe I can learn from? Because, it says in Proverbs 13:20 that whoever walks with the wise will become wise. And I get to meet some incredible people in my life and ministry, and I want to share those people with others so that they can benefit from that, and maybe grow and become wiser in their own life and have some mentors through this. And so I've found some uh, great encouragement from being able to pay it forward, and then running into people during the course of the year who tell me what an impact these podcasts have had on their life. I remember one young man during a convention I was attending in the United States came up to me and said, "Hey, Jeff Roper, I'm one of your disciples. You're mentoring me." And I thought, well, I don't know you. And he said, on your podcast, man, I love it. I listen to it all the time. And thank you for what you're doing. So that was really an encouragement. So paying it forward. The second reason is I want to expose some key leaders and some key people to a broader arena of people that I may know, the people who listen to this podcast. Because when I was first starting this podcast, I made a little acronym, and I still have it posted on the wall. That it's the word firm, and I wanted a firm foundation, and it stood for fix a problem, inspire the heart, renew the mind, and move to action. So I wanted through this podcast to fix problems. How do we address specific issues that you might face in ministry today? And it could be very controversial issues. Like one of the most downloaded episodes I've ever done was the intersection of the gospel and the gay community, where I interviewed my friend Brad Williams, and we talked about how do we do effective ministry amongst the LGBTQ community, and do it in such a way that is authentic in its love and genuine care for the people of that community, and maintaining our faithfulness to the gospel. And that was just such a powerful time to be able to do that. Or my interview with Brad Jersak on a More Christlike God. Man, that was a great interview. And that guy's got some great insight. So I wanted to be able to fix some problems for people, and also to inspire the heart, that people would just feel a little bit extra strength to make it another week, make it another year, to renew the mind, to change the way we think about some things, and then ultimately to move us towards action, to advance the gospel and to fulfill the mission of God in our life. Now, those are the two reasons why I've been doing this podcast for these past 100 episodes. And during this, there's been probably three big surprises that have happened. One is the scope of the podcast reach. One guest, uh, he told me he was actually invited to go speak at a conference in Australia, because some people in Australia were listening to the interview that I had done of this particular person. And it's like, well, geez, who in Australia would be listening to this? How'd they find it? And so it's amazing. When I look at the stats and I find out which countries, it doesn't tell me who the individuals are, but it just tells me countries where people are downloading the podcast, and that's just amazing. The other thing that was a real surprise is, if you've been tracking with me during this series of podcasts that I've done, I took a 2-year hiatus when I was engaged in my graduate studies at Life Pacific University, getting my master's degree. Something had to give, and so I just put the podcast aside. Ended up being for 2 years. And what amazed me was I was trying to justify in my mind, I'm not going to start it back up. And I thought, well, I should go and just check the download stats and see if anybody's actually even downloaded anything. And I was shocked. Man, I was really shocked at the numbers of people that had downloaded. Now, keep in mind, this is not like This American Life or any of the world famous podcasts. My slice of the pie is very narrow and very focused, and so I'm not talking uh, tens of thousands, but it is hundreds of downloads that had happened in that period. And I was completely blown away. It's like, wow, I haven't produced anything in 2 years and people are still listening. Who are these people? And then finally, the third surprise about the whole podcast thing is that people actually do listen. And it means so much to me when they express appreciation. I've already referenced a couple of those, but it does just absolutely amaze me that you would take a few minutes of your busy life, and while you're out running or mowing the grass or on your commute, you would spend some time listening to me, joining me in this podcast. And I do appreciate it. So, what lies ahead? Well, in some ways, I really don't know, but I know I'm not supposed to tell you that. What I would like to do is continue to provide you with rich content that's going to help you. So, what I would need from you, if you don't mind, is if there's something you would like me to address, some topic or person that you'd like me to interview, and you think that would be helpful for you, well, help me to help you. You can always drop me a line. You can email me at jroper@foursquare.org and say, hey, Jeff, I'd love to hear you talk about this on the podcast. And send me a note. I'd love to hear what would help you. Help me help you. Ultimately, I do want to move people to a deeper relationship and experience with God. And I do want to help move people towards a clear expression of the mission of God operating in and through their life. So that's being done by me continuing to pursue this idea of a firm foundation, fixing a problem, inspiring your hearts, renewing your mind, and moving to action, creating some type of a community of people who are all in for doing kingdom work and advancing the gospel around the world. So anyway, that's what I wanted to ramble on with you about today on this 100th episode of All In. And I want to thank you. I appreciate the fact that you join with me. Thank you for your prayers, and may God bless you guys. Hey, before we go, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Also, I'd like to encourage you to share this episode on social media or through email. Get your friends and family involved if you think it'll help them. And finally, if you benefit from this podcast and or you believe in our ministry of making disciples of nations by developing healthy Foursquare church planting movements, would you consider partnering with us in prayer and even financial support? Go to my website, jroper.com, and you'll see the link there that says support our work. We would appreciate it. It helps make this ministry possible. God bless you guys. It's your life. Now go live it.